Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today we're talking about Jean-Michel Jarre's Metamorphoses. Alright then, we are now officially entering into 2000s Jarre, the man's fourth decade of music. I see a lot of mixed opinions on the stuff he released in this era of his career, but believe me, I find this stuff to be no less worth discussing than any other part of the Jarre story. In fact, I find it disappointing that Jarre's 2000s stuff doesn't get more love in general. I mean, none of Jarre's 2000s albums are available on Spotify or iTunes or any of the usual places, which is a real shame, I gotta say. I'm gonna have to start linking unofficial uploads in the description. I really hope sometime in the future this will not be the case. But I think this lack of interest in Jarre's turn of the millennium work is especially weird in the case of this album right here. Because it's totally in character for what Jarre would do in 2000 and fits his image of this electronic pioneer who's continually kept up with the times, yet not in such a way that it ever really became embarrassing for him. Here Jarre took a lot of the techno and trance sounds surrounding him and added some other twists here and there and made what is, in my opinion, one of the guy's most forward-thinking, interesting, and just most enjoyable albums of his entire career. It's ridiculously underrated in my opinion. By the way, you want an extra mind-blowing tidbit? This album's producer, aside from Jarre himself, is a man named Joachim Garraud, who you may recognize as the guy who also produced David Guetta's first three albums. Yes, seriously. The man who was responsible for making one of the worst artists in electronic music somewhat tolerable to a point in his early days is also partially responsible for the incredible top-tier sound design and production of one of Jean-Michel Jarre's best albums, in my opinion. Not the kind of thing you'd ever be able to guess. But yeah, I digress. Let's talk about this album from an individual track basis. I basically like every track on this album about the same amount, but they all have their individual flavors to set themselves apart. And they all have individual track titles too, which helps as well. While this album does have a pretty cohesive sound that carries over everything, I don't think it's one that really could have gotten away with being 12 parts of the same whole, especially given the fact that most of these tracks have actual vocals in them, often even in English, and on a couple of tracks, delivered by Jarre himself, through vocoders and effects and that kind of thing, because of course. Though despite that, when you really get down to it, all the vocals and lyrics and all that, it's not the direct focus and something you specifically should pay attention to. I wouldn't really recommend paying attention to them in general. But, the voices are used more as, like, instruments. They're just part of the rich sonic tapestry that makes up each track on this album. So, there's so much to unpack on this thing. Nearly every track has something interesting to discuss. I should also mention that the CD copy I happen to own here has this giant fold-out thing surrounding it. And it's this just whoosh. Check that out. And it also Jarre has like this like track by track commentary thing that it is in French, unfortunately, so I, out of curiosity, ran it through Google Translate, typed it all out and checked it out, and there's actually some really interesting insights which I'll bring up in this video. So going down track by track, Je me souviens. I'm sorry, I'm not French. That's our opener. And the main interesting thing about this one is the presence of Laurie Anderson, listing off a bunch of random nouns. The voice, the tree, the house, the child, the rock, the blood, and Jarre chiming in by saying the title. In the commentary, he said this has some kind of connection to dreams, like it's simple iconography that anyone can recognize while asleep, which I guess is cool. But I just think the techno grooves of this track are excellent, and the piano melodies that come in occasionally bring it to maybe one of my favorite Jarre tracks, period. It's also worth noting that this track was later reworked into the title track from his Arrow compilation. However, unfortunately, that rework isn't nearly as interesting or engaging as this original version. Anyway, the second track here, C'est la vie, is a fast-paced, pounding trance thing with lots of warm strings surrounding it and a sensual and exotic performance from Natasha Atlas. The end result reminding me a lot of, like, mid-period Spangle, even though Spangle only had one album at this point and hadn't really hit their stride yet, but You know, it's that kind of sound. It's a very cinematic sounding track that works really well for me. Then we have Rendez-Vous à Paris, which aside from Jarre himself saying the title over and over, is kind of a low-key down-tempo track, which also crafts some very nice atmosphere, at one point involving a violin solo and some harps as well. The sound design on this album is seriously something else. It is just incredible all the way through. Anyways, Hey Gagarin is next, a tribute to the famous astronaut, of course. It's a vocoder-driven trance number, also delivered by Jarre's own voice, that it's admittedly not a huge standout. It's about what you'd expect Jarre making a straightforward trance song to sound like. But, you know, it also had some strings in there, which are a nice touch, especially at some points near the end where you just hear the strings of it by themselves. There are some cool spacey sound effects, too. I think it just works really well for what it's trying to do, even if not the most original composition he's ever come up with. Millions of Stars, meanwhile, is the kind of ambient soundscape piece that Jarre is known for. Like, apparently it's named after when he was in Egypt and he saw what the night sky looked like without all the light pollution we're used to in the city. This is like a typical Oxygen Part 1 type synth adventure with the usual classical inspired chord progression, although this time you also have a female voice, like, naming each of the chords in the progression, and you also have Jarre's vocoder vocals again later. And also at the very end you got a nice warm orchestral string arrangement. The whole piece is absolutely beautiful, really the kind of thing that Jarre does best. But then there's probably my personal favorite track in the bunch, Tout, Bleu. Probably the catchiest track in the bunch, and mainly being carried by a pretty big male chorus, repeating the same musical phrases and talking about how everything is blue in your eyes. That's translated. It sounds really huge and emotional. It also has several other vocals speaking in various languages, basically all giving weather reports as if you're inside a plane or something. Jarre said it was inspired by, like, you know, how actual weather report people tell you how the weather is going to be terrible, but in a really cheerful voice. Kind of a strange concept, I'll admit. Jarre even referred to the choir as kitsch in his commentary. Even though personally I think he's come up with much sillier stuff than this. We'll get to the track right after this one. But I think why this might be my favorite track on the album, despite sounding just like something that Jarre would do, it doesn't sound like any other Jarre track out there, and it is the track on here that's most likely to get stuck in my head. I mean, granted, there's a lot of competition for best track on this album. It might be either the first two, depending on my mood, but I digress. Anyways, Love, Love, Love is a track that probably elicited some eye rolls just by the title. And the text-to-speech voice prominently featured here certainly doesn't help that. Everybody says, love, love, love. So I did it. So I did it. Encore, encore, encore. I feel like he was aiming at some, like, Kraftwerk-style computer love with that voice, but it sometimes comes off as like, boy, these love songs are so cliched, but I did it anyway. Everyone's gonna love that. That said, whether I take it as, like, sarcastically making fun of love songs or delivering some kind of track about a computer discovering what love is and wanting more, in both cases, I still like the idea, and again, the sound design and melodies way make up for the weird premise. The warm little synth stabs in the sections with the text-to-speech voice are just very nice and intimate, and there's the chorus section delivered via vocoder and some MIDI guitars for backup is also really nice. I mean, the vocoder voice is barely intelligible at all, though I think that might also be to the track's benefit. It's certainly one of the most memorable moments on the album, and one of my favorites, I think. And then we got Bells, which is a track I was initially gonna mark as one of the weaker moments here, because, like, it's got the super triumphant but still dark and dramatic melody driving it, though it's being played on this, like, MIDI bell sound that, while it sounds really huge, also sounds pretty fake. But as it turns out, Jarre's commentary gave me a really cool interpretation to, like, kind of explain that, because he said the track kind of signified the turn of the new millennium, and how, like, the bell sound is combining the hauntingness of something from the beginning of the century with a more industrial and technological sound, hence that's why it sounds like a computerized imitation of something really old. And it doesn't hurt that the melody is among the most memorable in the bunch as well. Then we get the kind of instrumental Miss Moon. A track that admittedly disappears from my head pretty quickly, but has enough interesting sounds and cool atmosphere to make up for it. You got weird electronic tinges that sound like they came from a different part of the world, but also warm synth pads and occasionally quite abrasive percussion, and a vocal soloist near the end performed by someone who I can't pronounce. I'm also told via the commentary that some of the hi-hat or shaker sounds in the background are actually a lawn sprinkler, which, once I noticed that, I couldn't unhear that. But even after that, like, I still couldn't help but feel like it's interesting how well that sprinkler sound is well integrated into the track. Like, wow. Anyways, Give Me a Sign is kind of a poppier track with a triumphant and catchy fourth Rendezvous style melody. Even if the lyrics are pretty sad, it's a quite memorable piece that stuck out as another highlight for me. And then finally we get to Gloria Lonely Boy, which probably should have been where this album ended, because, like, alright, Jarre said that this track was dedicated to transgender people going through psychological, physical, and emotional metamorphosis, tying into the album title. And while I think the sentiment is great, Jarre delivered the vocals himself via vocoder again, and I really think someone else probably should have handled that. And the track can be a little funeral march-y, though I suppose the issue deserved to be handled with that amount of emotional weight. And the string section at the end was a nice touch again. And the only track left is Silhouette, which is the only track on the album I didn't really see the point of. I mean, it's a neat ambient track with another solo female vocal performance, perfectly good stuff out of context, but it doesn't really add anything that a different track on this album couldn't have otherwise. It feels kind of pointless and tacked on, but whatever, I'm being nitpicky. So yeah, that's it for individual tracks. Admittedly, the stuff that's the most interesting to discuss when it comes to this album are the occasionally silly song premises, and if you take the lyrics throughout the album as the main focus, then you'll probably be disappointed to find out how dumb the lyrics can be sometimes. But like I said, despite the fact that the lyrics are this new, fresh element that Jarre's implementing into this album, the text itself is emphatically not the focus. The real focus is the sound design, which is some of his most detailed, rich, just overall amazing sounding stuff that Jarre has ever had to his name. It allows tracks with otherwise silly ideas to be taken seriously. And that should be really saying something coming from freaking Jarre. Zuluk didn't have any English lyrics in it, but it's like 20 times sillier than anything on here. This album has lines like, I can move, I can groove, hey, yeah, or the above mentioned, I can see in your eyes so many guys in lawn sprinkler rhythms. And yet, I can still take this album 100% seriously. I think that is a massive testament to this album's sound design and composition that I am still able to do that. Especially with Jarre's history of albums that I can't fully take seriously, like Zuluk and Magnetic Fields and others. Wait till we get to Tio and Tia. But yeah, the melodies are all freaking great, the instrumentation is varied and consistently beautiful and always well integrated into the electronic elements as well. I love how this album stands out in the Jarre catalog and how, despite taking from some of the styles of the time, doesn't feel attached to its time. Because it still sounds futuristic and forward-thinking even now. Even Jarre's own vocoder voice, despite his singing not being the best, is integrated pretty well into this album for the most part. Most of my issues with this album come down to minor nitpicks that I can ignore pretty easily. This is an album that not only sounds exactly what you would expect Jarre to sound like in 2000, but is also so much more than that. I really think Jarre went the extra mile on this album and made something that doesn't sound quite like anything else out there and rose above some weird ideas to just become one of the most stellar productions I've ever heard out of the guy. Not much else to say. Metamorphoses is one of my personal favorite Jarre albums for sure. I think it's absolutely worth people's time. I'm overall feeling an 8.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. If you want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So that's all for today. See you next time.